Hey everyone, it's great to be back, and I hope you're all having an awesome day. So, as I said in my last video for Dirge of Cerberus, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII has been a big topic of discussion recently after the confirmation that the Final Fantasy VII Remake is in fact part of it. Back when Crisis Core first came out, I remembered enjoying it a lot, while mostly playing it in between different college classes and other places like my local train station. While not feeling quite near the level of a full-screen console experience, it did feel fun to jump into in short bursts, and gave me a story that I, again, at the time, felt pretty content with. But that was a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about over 14 years ago, people. Needless to say, it was time to give this one a revisit, and that's just what I did. So, let's not dilly-dally shilly-shally anymore, and see just how well Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII for the PSP holds up today. Released by Square Enix in 2007 for Japan and 2008 for the US, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII is an action RPG, taking place before the events of the original Final Fantasy VII. It tells the story of Zack Fair, a character we were only given small bits of information on in the original game. Trying to climb his way up the ranks of soldier, Zack is a very energetic and positive character, though a bit clumsy and absent-minded as well. The game focuses on various story elements that would eventually lead to the events of Final Fantasy VII itself, meaning to bridge together multiple plot points and even connect the series with the other compilation titles up to that point. While Dirge of Cerberus focused on a more action-heavy direction with its shooting mechanics, Crisis Core takes a step back into the RPG realm, with sword slashing, summon spells, and the ability to level up once again. And unlike Dirge of Cerberus, Crisis Core does a much better job of making you feel like you're back in the world of Final Fantasy VII once again. While not as graphically ambitious as this is a PSP game we're talking about here, the art style does a much better job of capturing the little details that made these locations so memorable in the first place, and I was glad to see it. The story is quite a lot to talk about, but I'll give it my best shot. The game follows very select points in Zack's life, particularly those pertaining to the original Final Fantasy VII. We see his rise in soldier ranks, determine where he learned how to fight, as well as how he acquired the iconic Buster Sword, the rise and eventual downfall of Sephiroth, Zack's prior relationship with Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, Hojo, the Turks, and others, and the relevance of new characters like Angeal, Hollander, and finally, Genesis, the mysterious character that we were only given hints about in Dirge of Cerberus. Putting all of these elements together, we were to be given a piece that could stand on its own, while also providing important details that would help lay down the foundations of Final Fantasy VII itself. Before I really delve into the story's intricacies, I'd like to talk more about the game's structure first, as well as its gameplay mechanics. Unlike the counterpart to which it's based, Crisis Core follows a mostly straightforward style, with chapters that separate the major events and locations that you'll be visiting. It's meant to be enjoyed in either small chunks or large binges, being that this was designed for a portable system, and I'd say it pulls this off rather well. There's no point where I remember feeling like I couldn't wind down from whatever I was doing in a 15-minute time frame, and that's not something I say about JRPGs very often. You still have save points, but they appear very frequently, and you're always given the chance to save in between chapters. Aside from the Shinra headquarters and the areas outside of it in Midgar, Zack goes to various regions of the planet throughout the game, like Wutai, Junon, Nibelheim, and locations we hadn't seen before, like Banora. This also helps the game feel less repetitive outside of the missions, which I'll talk more about later. The game is also graphically pretty nice looking for its time. While some of the environments, scenery, and NPC characters could clearly use more details, the main character models all look great and do a good job of remaining faithful to the look and style of the original game. At the time of the game's release, it would often get compared to Kingdom Hearts, and this was not exactly unwarranted. Ignoring the fact that they're both action RPGs, you can see little nods in character expressions, weapons, and even a few limit breaks. For example, Cisne's weapon here clearly resembles Axel's chakrams, and I just can't look at this Lucky Star's limit break in any other way.
You can do it, Zack!
Yeah! I'm on fire now!
I honestly thought Winnie the Pooh was going to join Zack in battle the first time I saw it. The game's combat system is pretty straightforward action RPG affair. The slots in the bottom right part of the screen show the various commands you can use depending on what materia or abilities you have equipped, which you can switch between using the shoulder buttons. X button selects and uses them. Pressing it for your basic attack multiple times also starts a small combo chain. Triangle will serve as your block button to lessen the damage taken, and square serves as a dodge roll. You have magic points MP to limit your magic use, and ability points AP to limit your ability use. There's also a feature new to this franchise called Materia Fusion, which allows you to combine various materia and items to create new, more powerful materia. While it's not really necessary for completing the game, it can be fun to mix and match just to see what you'll get for it. Now, here's the part that's going to be a little harder to talk about. A large portion of the game's combat revolves around one specific mechanic, a system called the Digital Mind Wave, or DMW. This system involves a small slot machine-like reel up in the top left corner of the battle screen. It lands on 3 sets of numbers and character portraits, which update as you meet more people in the game. These go off at random during battle until sets of 3 are about to fall into place, whether through the numbers, portraits, or both. This is called the modulating phase. The numbers can determine when Zack or his equipped materia and abilities level up. For example, getting 3 7s in a row will gain Zack a level. The portraits determine other parts of the battle, such as limit break attacks and summon spells. It can also boost Zack's max HP, MP, and AP considerably, as well as give him some status buffs, ranging from not losing any MP with magic use for a limited time, all the way to temporary invincibility. All of these uses cost Zack 10 soldier points, or SP, which he gains by defeating enemies, or chooses to convert materia into more from the menu screen. The entire system was made to represent Zack's emotional state throughout the game. If something were to happen in the story that would cause Zack to become more emotional, the DMW would also be affected by it, changing up the rate at which some character portraits may appear in battle. This is also reflected in various stills and flashbacks that get shown throughout the reel spins. It certainly sounds interesting, right? So how does all of this actually feel to use? When I first played the game back in 2008, I didn't really think much of it at the time. I just sort of accepted it without delving into what went on behind the scenes. Now, I find it a bit more questionable. While it's true that the system behind this DMW is not completely random, a lot of it is, and I just don't see any justification behind it. When I play a JRPG, I expect for there to be a good amount of strategy involved, or at least more than what you'd get in a typical action game. Here, it seems to take most of that away, and leave all of your strongest attacks up to chance. This also causes some of these moves to happen at times that are not really necessary. To see Zack cast a powerful attack like Meteor Strike during a random battle with a soldier that takes 3 strikes to defeat is pretty annoying and wasteful, to put it mildly. It also doesn't help that you cannot skip the real turns or limit break attack scenes, and have to stop everything you're doing just to watch them again and again. And even when the reel comes up, there's still the chance it won't even land on anything, making it feel like an even bigger waste of time. The only things you actually can skip are the summon spell animations and the cutscenes of Zack's memories, which will occasionally repeat. At first, these things didn't really bother me much, despite confusing me heavily, but as the game went on, it definitely began to get on my last nerve. Since we're talking about the DMW, I'll also mention how leveling up seems to work. Now, in order for the game to not be a broken mess, this part of the DMW can't be completely random, otherwise Zack's leveling would be all over the place. What's really happening whenever Zack fights is that he gains an invisible amount of experience with each battle won, with no way for the player to really keep track of it. As this number increases, the chances of leveling up are also increased. Note that I said increased, not definite. This can cause Zack to sometimes not level up for an extremely long time, only to suddenly gain a bunch of level ups every battle or two to make up for this. Once again, I see no reason for things to work this way, and find it even more baffling that the game found it necessary to have me gain levels during battle instead of after it. These things don't necessarily ruin the experience, but the more I thought about it, the more confusing this setup became. I suppose if you enjoy your battles completely hectic and unpredictable, then you may get a kick out of the system, but I found myself getting more annoyed with it than anything else. This isn't to say that the combat can't be enjoyable at any point, as I remember multiple times where I came out feeling pretty satisfied after conquering a large boss or mini-boss, but a lot of that fun seemed dependent on how often I'd start getting these special attacks to pop up, and come into use at the right times. When they did, it felt great. I just wish I could say it was more often than not. Outside of the combat and the relatively straightforward structure of the game, you are thrown a large number of special minigame type scenarios. These range from defeating a certain number of troops all the way to slashing at missiles being fired in your direction. While most of these were relatively harmless and not too difficult to grasp, it was kind of surprising how often these missions would pop up throughout the main story. Did the developers not feel that their story and combat engine would be enough to maintain interest? Did they deem it necessary to add these scenarios in order to change up the game's pace? It's hard to tell, but I can't say I found any of them to do this title any real favors. In fact, the stealth mission section was flat out annoying and poorly designed. As the game proceeds and you continue to talk with other people, you'll begin to unlock new missions, which can be selected from your main menu whenever you come into contact with a save point. The missions have pretty large and interesting descriptions attached to them, but all of these merely consist of walking from point A to point B and defeating enemies along the way, every single time. While a few of them turn out to be very important, especially if you're looking to obtain all of the game's summon materia, the mission structure itself makes them feel more like a chore than anything else. Oh, and did I mention there are hundreds of them to complete? I am happy to say that the game's pacing was rarely an issue, as the straightforward style kept things moving pretty smoothly without much to stop you or take you out of the experience. I think the one major exception I felt in this case was the Sector 5 slums, which felt like nothing more than pointless running back and forth to extend the game's length artificially. The segments with Zack and Aerith talking in places like the iconic slum playground were great, and I wish they would have simply left things there. But you don't just play a Final Fantasy game for its gameplay. You want an excellent story to go with it, right? Let's delve more into the details of it, and just what does and doesn't work. To say this game's story had some major shoes to fill would be putting it mildly. Even without having played this yet, fans of Final Fantasy VII and the compilation titles up to this point already figured we'd have to delve into some particular aspects like the character of Genesis, Cloud and Zack's relationship, the Nibelheim incident, and of course, Zack's inevitable death, leading to the beginning of Final Fantasy VII itself. Needless to say, the hype was through the roof.
Don't make me regret this, Zack.
Sir!
Let's start with the good. Whether or not you end up liking Zack as a character throughout this game, as he does embody a lot of the stereotypes you see in shonen anime and other shows, like being happy-go-lucky, overconfident, absent-minded, etc., it's hard to deny that he still becomes a pretty lovable goof as time goes on. I was ready to write him off as annoying and a one-note character up until the later portions of the game, where he finally started to show us the makings of a serious and calculating warrior, the personality I was hoping we'd get to see. It was also nice to see Zack's interactions with the rest of Final Fantasy VII's cast, like Cloud, Aerith, Tifa, Song of the Turks, and even a few surprise interactions like Yuffie and the implied shot of Vincent in his coffin. While the latter of these events felt like little more than fan service, I admit that I got a kick out of most of them. And of course, the last truly great thing to mention is the game's end sequence, but I'd like to save talking about that for just a little later. Now, let's try to delve into some of the more complicated and, frankly, controversial material. One of the more important relationships the game slowly begins to cover is the one between Angeal, Genesis, and Sephiroth. Angeal, the man possessing the Buster Sword, serves as a mentor to Zack in the beginning, up until his disappearance during a mission in Wutai, putting their previous bond into question. Zack is also told to locate Genesis, another Shinra soldier who disappeared while clones of him begin to pop up everywhere. As the game goes on and Zack teams up with Sephiroth to locate them both, we learn that Hollander, a former Shinra scientist, previously used cells from Genova, the extraterrestrial life form said to be the quote-unquote mother of Sephiroth, to experiment on both Angeal and Genesis in an experiment called Project G. This was yet another instance of characters in this series, like Sephiroth, being experimented on through the use of Genova cells to create human hybrids with Genova, back when Shinra believed Genova to be one of the ancients. Sephiroth was considered to be perfect, while Genesis was deemed a failure, due to his body degrading throughout most of the game. Genesis would go on to see Sephiroth as a rival, with Angeal typically coming between the two of them.
Enough! Angeal.
The writers clearly tried to make Genesis a very big part of the game, inserting him into multiple parts of the story, and even placing him in sections of the game that impacted the original Final Fantasy VII. But how is he as a character? Well... Warning, the following statement by Justin is likely to be considered controversial to fans of Crisis Core, and as such may cause side effects such as nausea, fatigue, and overall saltiness. Please consult your doctor before use. I just didn't find Genesis to be a very compelling character. The majority of his dialogue in the English version of the game consists of him reciting quotes from Loveless, a poetry book turned play in the world of Final Fantasy VII.
My soul corrupted by vengeance. Wings stripped away. The end. is the bringer of life, the gift of the god. Legend shall speak of sacrifice.
Shut up!
All that awaits you
Shut up! I'm warning
is a
you!
somber morrow.
Due to this, it was hard to even establish an identity for him at first, as he rarely spoke past those lines of dialogue the entire time. From what I could decipher, after Hollander failed to cure him of his degradation, Genesis set to reenact the poem in his own life, while trying to uncover the fabled gift of the goddess to find a cure, even though it was not made clear what the gift actually was, due to the poem's final verse missing. Unfortunately, most of this wasn't even explained to us until far later into the game, if at all, so we had no idea what Genesis' real motivations or goals actually were for a large amount of time. In fact, some parts of it are still open to interpretation. Normally, I wouldn't allow my thoughts on one character to have such an impact on my opinion of a game, but in this case, Square was set on making Genesis the true main villain of the game, and one of the most important characters in relation to this and the original Final Fantasy VII story. I was even more bothered by his appearance during a scene inside the Mako reactor on Mount Nebel.
Am I a human being?
No such luck. You are a monster. Sephiroth, you were the greatest monster created by the Genova Project.
His addition to this scene may appear to be minor and just thrown in there for the sake of it, but if you look closer, the implications behind it are actually huge. Instead of Sephiroth coming to the incorrect conclusions about his origins on his own, we are being told that it was now due to the influence of Genesis, trying to convince Sephiroth that he too was a monster, all for the purpose of trying to get some of his cells to stop the body degradation. This is what would eventually cause Sephiroth to massacre everyone in Nibelheim and create the iconic scenes of destruction we now know. With the exception of this moment, everything else in the segment was executed in almost the exact same way as the original Final Fantasy VII, dialogue and all. This would only make Genesis' inclusion in it all the more glaring.
Genesis! No!
I want to be clear here, I don't hate the idea of Genesis himself, quite the opposite in fact. It's just his implementation in this game that I found to be so lackluster and disappointing. It's hard to accept the idea that this character now sets up so many of Final Fantasy VII's most important bits of lore, when the people at Square couldn't bother to give him even the slightest bit of personality at the same time.
Loveless again. You never change.
The retcons done here, especially in relation to the Nibelheim incident, felt unnecessary, to the point where I'd argue they actually hurt the original game's story in the process.
Yes. Genesis was a failure. I'll admit it.
I never had many issues with the game's plot and structure back when I first played it years ago, but re-examining it, I'm seeing way more segments that just make me stop and go, For example, Zack and Aerith's meeting and relationship is another confusing spot. We're now supposed to believe that both Cloud and Zack met Aerith by falling into the Sector 5 church, right in the same place as the iconic flower bed. That seems a little too unbelievable, humorous as it is. I also hate to say this, but warning, another controversial statement is about to follow. Please take cover now. I didn't feel like Zack and Aerith even had that great of a chemistry together, at least in the scenes we saw them in, despite the game's best efforts to make us believe they really had something. In fact, near the end, we are specifically told that Aerith wrote Zack over 89 letters during the time of his coma, and Hojo's experimentation on him and Cloud. And of course, Zack's visions of Aerith near the end of the game also signify that there was a deep connection. These are all very serious things, obviously, but her and Zack's actual scenes together prior to these moments still don't really match up with them. Although I was able to piece together the details of Zack's relationship with Angeal, I was surprised by how little info the game really provided on him. It was possible to piece everything together, particularly his motivations while going between working with Genesis, or protecting his honor as a soldier, which you'll hear about 5 million times, but for a relationship as important as he and Zack's, I felt like Angeal's character deserved more. Despite these strange instances, there were plenty of character portrayals and moments that I did enjoy quite a bit. Cloud and Zack's relationship, while off to a slow start at first, actually worked pretty well to me, and gave us a different but believable side of Cloud that we hadn't seen before. I could understand people not liking his portrayal in this, but I admit I found it to be enjoyable at least. Sephiroth's moments were also well done, as the game managed to keep him mysterious and compelling enough to draw me in. Cissnei also proved to be one of the game's better characters, although I wished we could have seen more of her throughout the adventure. Another smaller detail that I found kind of funny was just how many people, all apparently near the top of Shinra's ranks, managed to betray or abandon Shinra throughout the course of this game. I was beginning to wonder how Shinra even survived as a company once all was said and done. Still, it was cool getting to see the inner workings of the organization for once. Perhaps I never noticed or cared about these details much before due to the fact that I was playing the game in short bursts and happy to just accept whatever Square had in store for me, but once again, I'm now left asking myself why things happen the way they do, a lot. With that said, it's time to talk about the game's final sequences, as well as what they meant for this game and Final Fantasy VII itself going forward. As Zack chases Genesis down to depths of judgment, we learn that Loveless, the poem he constantly quotes, is written in sections on multiple stone tablets throughout the caves. Zack also begins to piece together the fact that Genesis was implementing this poem into their own lives, including its main characters, overall story direction, etc. After Zack decides he's going to try and quote-unquote save Genesis, they enter a final battle where Genesis transforms into a new form called Genesis Avatar. It admittedly looks pretty cool. While the fight isn't particularly difficult, it does go on for quite a long time due to his high HP count. Once he's finished, you fight him in his regular form one more time before we see the culmination of it all. After the fight, Genesis comes to the realization that the gift of the goddess was in fact his pride as a soldier, which he had previously lost, due to the revenge he sought against all those in the company who had previously betrayed him. Following this, a being named Minerva emerges from a statue in the distance and actually cures Genesis of his degradation. Yes, of all people in this game, Genesis is the one who gets to have somewhat of a redemption arc. But that's not even the strange part. This being, Minerva, is hinted to be acting on the will of the life stream, and as such, the planet itself. Once again, we have a moment that seems like a small occurrence, but actually has huge implications about Final Fantasy VII's lore. What am I talking about this time? Well, now, for the first time, we have acknowledgement of a character acting on behalf of the life stream, that can go so far as to cure or revive a person, and who knows what else, as it wasn't made entirely clear. If that's true, and this being can decide whether a person can live based on the level that the planet deems worthy, then what stopped it from bringing anyone else back from the dead? I mean, doesn't that mean it could also potentially bring back Aerith? I've said too much!
Well, I guess I should get going then.
My point is, this changes the entire perception of what the world in Final Fantasy VII was capable of in the first place. And I'm not sure if I like this one better or not, as it could imply that death has less of a permanence than we once believed. As of right now, it's too soon to say if this will actually mean anything going forward, but in the meantime, I just can't help but raise my eyebrow to it. And then there's the final moments. Yes, this is the section of the game that everyone talks about and remembers very fondly. It's the part that made the entire game for many. And you know what? I'm happy to say that yes, this section actually does hold up very well. It's put together brilliantly and makes a good use of the game's combat system. As Zack faces an entire army's worth of Shinra troops, you begin to see the reels slowing down and no end to the battle in sight. After you're brought down, Zack has one more final moment before the scenes we all knew were coming. The final moments of Zack Fair's life. While this obviously does not match the secret scene in Final Fantasy VII exactly, it does remain mostly faithful to it, and arguably does an even better job at conveying the emotion of it all. The final reel with Aerith's face popping up is especially poignant. This segment was masterful, and almost brought me back to the PS1 era of Square that I used to love in the 90s. But this got me thinking, was it all worth it? Was it worth going through the entire game with a combat engine that felt so flawed and frustrating, just to see one segment that provided a nice payoff to it? Was it worth seeing so many story elements changed in ways that arguably didn't improve on the original Final Fantasy VII at all? Years ago, I would have said yes, but now? I'm not so sure. I want to be clear that I did still have fun going back to this title. I still loved witnessing Zack's goofy yet lovable attitude during the most serious of moments, the additional scenes with him, Cloud, and Aerith, seeing a little more of Sephiroth pre-Nibelheim, and even revisiting other classic Final Fantasy VII locations with a new perspective. The game's pacing was also a nice change for RPGs, and one I didn't mind seeing in this instance. But at the same time, I can't go pretending like it held up quite the way I remembered. The plot outside of the Final Fantasy VII connections felt very loosely organized, and the more I think about the game's combat system, and how often I have to basically sit back and watch it play the game for me, the more of a headache I begin to get. This also got me thinking, what about all the people who still praise this game now? Are we seeing things differently? Well, I have a few theories about that. These are conclusions I've come to based on discussions I've had with others, and simply what I see when I look online, noting that, of course, this is not some be-all, end-all list of points, and that I'm sure there's plenty of other explanations out there. 1. They played the game when it first came out, like I did, and kept the memories of their favorite parts in their head and heart, while forgetting about all the rest. No, seriously, I was in this very group. 2. They never played Final Fantasy VII before, and were willing to forgive all of the plot changes. 3. They actually enjoyed the DFW and the chaotic nature behind all of it, not really caring about being able to strategize in combat, and just wanted to blast through the story. And 4. They just happened to really like this game anyway, since it was a way to revisit classic characters in a new light. They were just glad to see it was something different, and didn't mind the plot changes, or simply didn't try to think too hard about them. Since this was a portable game, and it was very easy to miss a lot of details. Or maybe they even considered the changes to make the original story better. I don't personally get that one, but hey, I'm sure they're out there. I also partly blame all this on the game's scarcity, as the only way to play it was, and still is, the original PSP. Just like Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, there was no way to buy the game digitally, and gamers were left with no other options. Birth by Sleep eventually began to appear in HD collections on the newer platforms like PS3 and PS4. Crisis Core, however, did not.
Even if the morrow is barren of promises, nothing shall forestall my return.
As I said before, I was definitely in the group of people that used to defend this game, but over the years I've found that harder to do. I still enjoyed my time with it, as blasting through all these familiar locations, pulling off combos and things, was all still pretty satisfying, and the voice acting felt good enough not to give me any major pauses. But looking back and noticing all of the game's major flaws now, it's simply a lot harder to ignore these issues. I don't want this to come off like some kind of an attack on the game or the people who still love it today. I mean, you enjoy what you enjoy. This game connected with a lot of people, including myself when I was younger, and nothing would ever take that away from us. In fact, by all means, find a way to play this one again and see if you still feel the same way about it today. For me, personally, it was still worth going back to, as a longtime fan of Final Fantasy VII and JRPGs in general. Just know that your experience now may not be quite what it was back then. And that's okay too. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this fondly remembered PSP game as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.